So that's me up there. I happened to write that book. And in the course of writing that book, I got to think about, for about the 2 years I was writing it, all of the ways that technology can be dangerous, can ruin society, and also all the good things about it. And how it can save humanity, how it can help us accelerate lots of good things around, genetic medicine, solar power, saving lives with different kinds of transit deliveries like zipline in Africa. But one thing that kept jumping up at me there was data, because the more and more time I spent learning about startups and technology, it became very clear to me that data was at the heart of everything that every business now does in startup land, because every single startup is a data business. No matter what they tell you they actually do, they are a data business. Let's see if we get the clicker working. There we go. How many of you have followed this story? It's been pretty dramatic, huh? How over the span of about 2 months, Facebook has looked like something that was a sure thing to Facebook looking like it's going to be heavily regulated and might lose a lot of users. So what happened with Facebook, the problem that they're experiencing right now, is not only a data problem, it's a trust problem. And anyone in the world of startups may tell you their primary goal is to acquire users, it's to sell things, and that's all fine and good. But no startup can succeed or exist if it doesn't have trust. Your customers have to trust you. The people that are using your service have to trust you. Trust is absolutely essential to building businesses. But startups and tech companies in particular have taken trust for granted for quite a while, as you can see with Facebook, as you can see with lots of other problems we've had with data. So today what I want to talk to you primarily about is data and trust. How they're linked, why they're so important, and these 4 topics. How you handle data really, really, really matters today. Probably far more than you can think about when you're just thinking about how do I get that $100,000 to get the company off the ground. What questions to ask about your data. By that I mean, how do you think about your data? And there will be a series of questions about data. What is minimum viable data? So everyone here who has a startup knows what MVP is, minimum viable product. But minimum viable data isn't really a concept yet that's widely understood or widely used. I think it should be. And lastly, why building a company for minimum viable data, for MVD, is actually the best path to growth. So let's get started. So loss of trust is very, very expensive. This is what Facebook is finding out right now. It's also what many other startups have found out after they've been hacked and their users' identities have been stolen, or their users have gotten emails from people that they didn't trust or didn't know. We can see how expensive it was with Facebook, because when you look at that chart, you see the peak and then the decline. That's really expensive. How expensive? $80 billion expensive. So most of you will probably never even get to a company that's worth 500 million. I mean that no disrespect, but that's just the math. So imagine losing 80 billion in the span of a month. This is why trust and data are so important. So the metaphor that I think most people use for data now is data is like oil. I actually don't like that metaphor as much as data is like oxygen. When I say data is like oxygen, what I mean is that you need it to grow. Any startup does, just like a garden. But it can also burn down your house. If it's used the wrong way, it's explosive. So here's a series of questions about data to ask yourself. And I'm going to pause for a minute and let everyone read this very quickly. It's a fairly long list. Now, the reality is, every single one of these questions is actually a really hard question that probably requires a serious discussion. Every single one of them. Some of them are things that no startup wants to think about. Because just thinking about what might be causing you to think about that question is unpleasant. If you are hacked and someone steals your data, how are you going to respond? What are you going to tell your customers? How will you respond to lawsuits? Do you have a plan in place? So the first piece that was on there was, how do you request data? And the reason I picked this news article to refer to, are any of you familiar with what happened with this news article? With the Strava case? So Strava is a fairly successful startup. They've basically cornered the market for crazy competitive cycling, people who are runners. Lots of people post their times on Strava, the most competitive people you probably can imagine in Silicon Valley, and they compare it to see who's gone the fastest over a race or over a course. And Strava had the smart marketing idea, and it was a smart marketing idea, of posting a global heat map of where all its users were. The problem was, some of its users were in places like secret bases in Afghanistan, where their location was actually a life-threatening piece of information. So if you're Strava, would you have possibly thought about this? No, it's a really hard thing to think in advance about stuff like this, because there's just too many permutations. But Strava made an even bigger mistake before this. They didn't ask people if they wanted to opt into the data. They didn't even really give them a chance to opt out of the data. They just took the data and published it. So another data question. Who is the data from? In this case, the article is referring to a hack of a company called VTech. Does anyone remember that hack? Is anyone familiar with it? So VTech is a cordless phone company in China, and they had fairly lax security on systems that they made for children. So these were e-toys for kids. 227,000 children's records were hacked. There is a big fine coming through, but even so, the bad publicity that they suffered from this was miserable, and they obviously had to deal with a lot of fallout. So another data question to think about. How much data, what kind, and how long? The reason I picked a picture of fruits here is that I actually like to think of data as like fruits as well. That may sound a little strange, but hear me out for a second. So with data, you get lots of different kinds of it. It comes from lots of different places, and it has different rates of decay. By that I mean certain pieces of data will go bad or be good for certain amounts of time. With fruit, when it goes bad, you have to throw it out. The same thing with data. You need to throw out your data when it goes bad. And so as you're harvesting data, as you're pulling it in for your company, are you thinking, how much data am I pulling in? Meaning, how many kinds of fruit? What kinds of fruit? How long am I going to keep it for? How long will it stay in the refrigerator before it goes bad? How long will it stay with my company before it goes bad? Two other real good questions about data. Where is it, and how secure is it? Now, where is it may seem like a super obvious question. It's in Amazon, right? And you may even know which zone it's in. But you also may not know that it's being replicated to other Amazon zones, or there may be somebody that is a piece of your business, for example, an application performance management system, or a form supplier, or an email list, like MailChimp. And you may not know where their data is. So you have to ask yourself the question, where is your data? And it's not always an easy question to answer. Sometimes it takes a lot of time. The next question after that is, how secure is your data? And by that, of course, it's encrypted. Everyone stores their data in an encrypted fashion. We all know that. But there's different levels of encryption, there's different levels of security, and for different kinds of businesses, you may need it to be more secure than it may be right now. So for example, if you're in the financial services sector. Whatever is the level of security that's accepted, you may want to go above that just to be safe. So the last piece that I always say about data when people are thinking about data is always, always, always assume the worst. You know, for a lot of startups, like I said, when you're thinking about raising enough money to survive, the last thing you want to do is assume the worst about your data. But the good news is it actually isn't nearly as hard as you think to assume the worst. It's usually maybe a two-day exercise at most, and it could save you a world of pain later on. So now we're getting to minimum viable data, MVD. And I'll pause, let you read the definition. This is my definition. The concept is fairly self-evident, right? But the basic idea is, to date, startups generally look at data as how much of it can I grab? Maybe I'll use it later. What am I going to do with it later? I don't know, but I'm going to grab it. What if it's actually better to grab less than more? What if it's better for your growth and the long-term health of your company? And what if it's better for your long-term risk? Because I actually think that that's the truth. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. So the hidden costs of too much data. How many of you in the audience are engineers? A few engineers here? So you all probably understand what technical debt means, correct? How fun is it dealing with technical debt? How much time does it take? A lot of time. And it usually hits about year 2 or so after you got your A round, when somebody has to come in and you have to get used to running an organization at a truly global scale. With data, it's actually the same. Data has a debt. So here's some of the basic reasons why too much data is expensive. Storage cost is a pretty simple one, and I don't necessarily mean the cost of keeping it. By that I mean moving it in and out of storage. So it's a hidden cost. But as anyone here who's technical knows, moving things out of Amazon S3 is incredibly expensive. And you want to avoid it at all costs if you can. Unknown risks. So how often do people turn over in your companies? How often do engineers leave? What if they leave and some of the things that they were doing with data they don't bother to tell you? Not necessarily terrible things, but things like, where did I put the data? Or there's extra copies somewhere else. Or I'm storing it on a hard drive. So every extra bit of data that you collect that you don't need creates more unknown risks. Maintenance. So people think that data is a static entity, you just collect it and you're done. And that's not actually true at all. Because as people who work with data for a living, for many years understand, data grows and data has a life of its own. So for example, you may have to change data schema or change the way your data is structured in your startup over time. Each time you do that, the more data that you have that you're sitting on top of, it means it's more expensive to make these changes. So think of it this way. If you build a house, and the house is built on lots and lots of small pieces that don't necessarily fit to each other well, and they're all kind of glued together, whenever you have to build again on top of the house, it's even more expensive and messier. So technical debt, we already talked about briefly. The concept of technical debt is essentially that over time, your technology decays and you have to fix it. Data debt and technical debt are often closely interlinked because so much of data revolves around storage mechanisms around it, encryption, lots of pieces that are closely tied to technical debt. So these are all reasons why data actually costs a whole lot more than you think. The biggest one, of course, is unknown risks. And that's the one that will keep people up at night. But the best reason of all to have as little data as possible is it's simply the right thing to do. Think of it this way. If you were the customer, which would you prefer? Somebody to collect as little information about you as possible or as much? And this wouldn't be a problem if everyone told you what they were doing all the time, but they don't. And sometimes that's a rush. because they're in a hurry to get things done. Sometimes it's a convenient decision where they think, oh, if I make it opt out, I won't have enough people to make my newsletter work, or I won't have enough people to really do a good data survey or an A/B. So very often it's super convenient to do the wrong thing. But over time, doing the right thing is much, much better. Just looking at my time quickly. So it is much easier to start from minimum viable data than to add on minimum viable data later as a concept. And this is actually a Rube Goldberg machine designed to squeeze orange juice, believe it or not. But if you can imagine looking at this machine up there, how hard would it be to retrofit that machine and add new parts to it to upgrade it? It would be a nightmare. It's the same thing with minimum viable data. So if you design from the beginning for your business to run with as little data as possible, it's much, much easier to upgrade your business later on. Because you're building from much closer to a clean slate, a simple foundation, and you won't need to deal with something like that. You'll deal with something much smaller and much simpler where any engineer can come in, look at your processes and say, oh, I understand how this works. Additionally, this will be part of the DNA of your company. So as you're seeing with Facebook, the DNA of Facebook from the very beginning, and I don't think they were being evil, I think they were just being growth-minded. The very DNA of Facebook was, we will gather as much data as possible and figure it out later. This came from the very, very first way that they started. So when you engineer for minimum viable data from the beginning, you teach your employees, you teach your users, you teach your venture capitalists as well that this is how you're operating. So I'll take a quick pause. If you want to take a picture, if you're a business and you're interested in this, these are 6 basic steps to minimum viable data. And this makes it much simpler than it really is. But this, if you follow this checklist, it gets you a pretty good way along towards creating a minimum viable data structure. Minimum viable data also, it's not an end state. It's a constant process. You have to continuously work towards it. And as you work towards it, you'll learn more and more about it, and it gets easier. But this checklist should be a guide, hopefully. So I wanted to say thank you for having me on stage to talk about this. At startup competitions, people almost never talk about things like this. Almost never. It's kind of like having an insurance salesman come on stage and talk to you about stuff. The reason that I actually got so interested in this, aside from what I talked about in the beginning of the speech, was I noticed about 2 or 3 years ago that people were tagging my children's pictures in Facebook and applying facial recognition to it. And so my children were basically losing control of their data because other people were tagging them. And this struck me as not really being a good way to work with customers and users, that there should be a better way to handle this. Because my children, shouldn't they be able to decide whether they want to hand out their data or not? And seeing it in Facebook, seeing it in other places, it made me realize that this is just the way people think right now. It really doesn't have to be that way. And because startups are the next generation and startups will set the tone for the future, startups can change that and make it clear that we're actually better off with less data and not more. Thank you very much.